One of the things that I think is so helpful and even delightful about your writings on centering prayer is the way that you connect it to theories of the unconscious that we have in this century to help us in our spiritual journey. Could you talk a little bit about the unconscious in relation to the spiritual journey and centering prayer?
Well, the unconscious is a very significant aspect of the spiritual journey, and as you know, it was discovered about 100 plus years ago by Freud, and it's been, as a discovery, I think pretty much accepted throughout the psychological community, whether they agree with some of his other ideas or not. But the fact that there is an unconscious and that this has been brought forward is certainly something that all religions have to take into account, especially if they present the religion as a process or a series of stages or see a certain progression in the practice of the religion. So religion is not a brainwashing process, but rather a liberating process in which one freely accepts the journey and the process and its consequences in our psychological awareness. And so, depending what's in the unconscious, we experience joy or distress when it comes to full awareness. And how we handle that awareness and our attitude towards it is a crucial point for spiritual direction and for the proper negotiation of the spiritual journey. We are told that as the child begins to separate from the mother and begins to develop self-consciousness, or the separate self sense, after about 11 months or so, generally speaking, it begins to look upon the gratification of its instinctual needs for security, approval, affection, and power and control as sources of happiness. And so it looks for the gratification of these programs as well as to avoid their frustration. So its ego is also developing as these programs for happiness fossilize into centers of gravity, call them energy centers for lack of a better term, in which their thoughts or desires or reflections or preoccupations and behavior begin to circulate like planets around the sun, so that anything, event, or persons entering into that sphere of gravity is judged on the basis of whether it fulfills one of these programs or hinders it, or rather than on the objective value of this object or person. Hence the beginning of a life of illusion, because we're looking at a world that has to conform to our desires or presuppositions or expectations. Hence anything that doesn't fit in there is unreal or unwanted, and thus we're not in contact with the objects in themselves, or with their objective value, if such they have. And so as this process takes place during the socialization period from 4 to 8, it becomes much more complex, because now we're related with some other developing egos, plus important adults besides our parents. Now we have to deal with nurses or teachers or preschoolers or whatever. So one hits conscious life, you're carrying with us a lot of baggage that is dynamite, depending on the situation. And as soon as an unpleasant experience explodes in your face or mentally or in your heart or whatever, off go instantaneously and irrepressibly a feeling of grief, anger, humiliation, shame, discouragement, fear, hatred,
Resentment.
and they get more complex. And the more complex ones, Christian tradition called the capital sins, which were not personal sins, but tendencies to, in pursuing one's own I am, or one's own needs, to disregard the real needs of other people.
The so-called 7 deadly sins.
Yes. And these basically, if you remember, are pride,
Avarice,
envy, lust,
gluttony.
Gluttony. Good, you have learned your catechism well. I see. So, daily life then, for this person, consists in trying to deal with these afflictive emotions that go off often during the day, with more or less severe consequences. And when these consequences become very painful, such as emotional trauma, involving especially such things as rejection, oppression, abandonment, loneliness, put-downs, preference for other siblings, and all the other hazards of growing up as a child, then some of them are so painful that they're repressed into the unconscious, so that we don't have to feel them anymore. But the energy, the negative energy that was emotional, lingers and is simply warehoused in the body. But for the person, it's hidden, though often perfectly obvious to people who are close to us and see us. And so we adjust to the fact that they're not going to change, at least not overnight. So we plan our lives around their control issues so as not to set them off, or around their security issues or their affection esteem. And we never criticize them in public because we know God only knows what will happen. So as soon as any feeling goes off, as St. Thomas Aquinas said in the 13th century, the body always is affected, and this is now reinforced by modern medicine. Just to take anger, adrenaline always goes off when we are irritated. Now, the commentaries of the imagination seem to be pre-recorded tapes. So as soon as we're upset, if you don't do something immediately to ward off the intensity of that feeling, the defenses go on, and one of these defenses that go off is, of course, the commentary. How can they do this to me? I'm always treated badly. Nobody loves me. Or again, I muffed it again. And all of these cliches from our culture. I must always get straight A's and all of this. What will mother say, and etc. All of this stuff is sheer ego. That is to say, it's the language that is supposed to be discontinued in Jesus' recommendation in the sentence, close the door. The equivalent meaning is stop the interior dialogue. And if occasionally we achieve what we want, then we fall into the other extreme, which is self-inflation, pride, and exaltation, which is equally harmful as depression or anger or grief and so on.
It sounds like a kind of spiritual manic depression, just going from one pole to the other.
Yes, pretty much. And if it's extreme, then you are bipolar. So the whole false self is neurotic in its tendency, and it doesn't take much to establish it as a disease. Most people don't think of their false self or their ego as as
It's a
an
disease.
illness or a distortion. But it would be very helpful to them if they did, because then they would understand why they need the divine therapy.
And maybe they would be up for it more. I mean,
Yeah,
willing,
they
have that,
the motivation.
yes, that
That's
consent.
why, in the 12 steps of AA are a step ahead of the rest of the population, in that they are aware of how unmanageable their lives is. Everybody's life is unmanageable. They just don't know it yet until it gets completely out of hand. And then they start being forced to do something about it, or in the case of alcohol, they just die. It's either a life or death decision.
Well, we're all addicted to ourselves, our identities, it
Yes.
seems, even more so than alcohol.
Yes, and that's why recovery isn't the final cure of our illness, because many people in recovery, I'm told, go into a depression. Why? Because they haven't addressed yet the emotional sobriety, which is the dismantling of the addictive process. The addictive process is the false self, really, and it almost certainly develops into some kind of an addiction if you live long enough, because that's its whole direction, to keep hiding from the pain of repressed material or of repeated frustrations that are becoming intolerable. So what goes on in the inner room depends largely on one's commitment to go there. And one's commitment to go there depends in large part on how clearly one recognizes that one needs help, or that one has a serious illness, and that it's a matter of life and death, whether you go there or not. That's very clear in an alcohol addiction. But since it's not that clear in the other lesser addictions, or in the addictive process itself, people postpone or disregard or hide from their guilt feelings or their painful emotions of grief or humiliation or whatnot. An addiction is simply a masterpiece of the false self, in which one is so preoccupied with this addiction from the point of view of time and preoccupation and desire that you haven't got any time to think about how much pain you have and that you're choosing to face. The healing is in facing what you most dislike in yourself that is causing the addiction in the first place. And this is what the divine therapy mercifully offers to do. Jesus himself called himself a physician. I'm sure he would have included the psychiatric profession if it had existed in his day. So the result then of bringing with us into daily life these unconscious desires that are then frustrated, causing us to overreact, not because of the situation, but because of the baggage that the present problem simply reminds us of, plus the commentaries that raise the initial distress to ever greater levels of intensity, so that eventually, if it's anger, we move through irritation, annoyance, anger, rage, then temporary insanity. So, well, by the time you get there, you obviously wind up in an emotional binge, which may last for several hours, including the whole day, for a week, and sometimes for some people for the rest of their lives. So this is the journey in reverse, or the spiritual journey, and it's going in the opposite direction at top speed, and it's based on the emotional illness of which in turn is based on not knowing where true happiness is to be found, and hence is almost inevitable. So inevitable that it has come to be considered original sin, that is to say, the patrimony of everyone as a result of having rejected God in the Judeo-Christian scheme of things, but which from a scientific point of view could also be looked at as a failure to evolve from lower forms of life. So this poor human being then is starting out in life with this heavy strike against it, namely the misunderstanding that the gratification of its emotional programs is happiness or will lead to happiness. So that in pursuing desperately programs for happiness that can't possibly work, you are solidifying or cementing a life of human misery, because as you're constantly frustrated in finding happiness in the gratification of one of those things, or in dealing with the false belief systems that you interiorized as a result of your religious, patriotic, ethnic, or family enculturation. Not that they're not values in culture, but they're not absolutes. So how to raise the human condition to an awareness of this situation and its urgency and its ramifications, and to reduce the amount of distraction of useless things that prevent us from exposing ourselves fully to the reality of our unconscious and the enculturated nature even of our religious practices. This is crucial for the change of society. No amount of politics or discussion is going to change it until enough people change themselves so that they're not pouring more negative energy into the same old cesspool. And so but this doesn't mean that we feel separate from this melodrama. Actually, it only is the reverse, that one feels more and more immersed in this human situation in which we have accountability just by being a human being. So the contemplative journey is the most responsible of all responses to God, because so much depends on it. The future of humanity, the healing of the wounds of humanity, our own deepest healing. It's not just a method of meditation or a practice to find personal peace. It's basically a total surrender to the human condition in all its ramifications, including its desperate woundedness, all of which is symbolized in the agony in the garden and the cup which Jesus was asked to drink, which he declined or pleaded not to have to drink. And perhaps with some of these reflections it's clearer why no human person, or no merely human person, could possibly drink to the dregs the capacity for human brutality and evil that humans are capable of. At the same time, what even makes it more tragic is they're fully capable of becoming God, maybe not the fullest sense of the term, but in a very real way, where the light and the life and the love of God is predominant and pouring through them, maybe not obviously, but as a channel, so that they're leaving behind a trail of healing and compassion and reconciliation wherever they go or whatever they do, even without trying, because now they are rooted in the divine compassion and mercy, and they're manifesting not the false self anymore, not the junk and the unconscious, but rather the pure light of the image of God within us and the likeness to God, which is the assimilation of the attitudes, specifically the mind and heart of Christ, into our everyday life.